Breaking news tonight, President Trump breaking his silence on Republican Senate candidate Roy Moore. The president defended Moore, saying he denies allegations by women who say they were either abused or pursued inappropriately by Moore when he was in his 30s. Let's dig deeper now with our specialists. Let me go to you first, David Swerdlick. We finally heard from the president today. Some rather stunning, but maybe not so stunning comments from the president on the South Lawn of the White House as he was leaving for Thanksgiving. Let's play some of that.
We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat, Jones. Roy Moore denies it. And by the way, he gives a total denial. And I do have to say, 40 years is a long time. He's run 8 races, and this has never come up. So 40 years is a long time. The women are Trump voters. Most of them are Trump voters. All you can do is you have to do what you have to do. He totally denies it.
And David, what does it say about where we are in our politics today when the President of the United States is saying he'd rather have an accused child molester than a Democrat in the U.S. Senate?
Right. Well, let me say what it says about President Trump's response, Jim. Look, the president is saying that Roy Moore denies the allegations, and the president obviously is entitled to take Roy Moore at his word. Once you start throwing in, well, we don't need a Democrat, once you start throwing in, well, this was 40 years ago, you're muddling what he's saying. It's no longer just about whether or not he believes Roy Moore or not. He's saying people should make a political calculation that even if these allegations are possibly true, there's still reasons to vote for Roy Moore, which really shows how far we've gone with the president's view of the Alabama race and in terms of how he wants to address the issue of sexual harassment.
And Rebecca Berg, you've covered Republican politics. Can you imagine a scenario? Can you imagine a scene like the one of President Trump campaigning with Roy Moore before this election in December?
It would be a huge political risk, even though you consider that most of Roy Moore's supporters are Trump supporters, that Trump recognizes that his political base is wrapped up in this. He wants to keep their support, show that he understands their priorities in this race. But at the same time, if you send Donald Trump to Alabama to campaign for Roy Moore, all of this work that Republicans have done on Capitol Hill, elsewhere in the country to try to distance themselves from Roy Moore and the allegations against him, all of that work is erased. It's for nothing. The Republican Party brand is inextricably linked to Roy Moore if Donald Trump goes out there and campaigns. Now, an endorsement, definitely a step in that direction, and it does undo some of the work that Republicans have done to try to distance themselves. But going out there is a whole other level.
Right, and what did Jeff Flake say the other day at the party of President Trump and Roy Moore were toast? Right.
Exactly.
Jeffrey Toobin, President Trump also gave his perspective on the wave of allegations we've seen across all industries, but more recently in Congress. Let's listen to that. I'll get your response.
Mr. President, what is your message to women? This is a pivotal moment in our nation's history.
Women are very special. I think it's a very special time because a lot of things are coming out, and I think that's good for our society, and I think it's very, very good for women, and I'm very happy a lot of these things are coming out, and I'm very happy it's being exposed.
Do you believe Congress should release the names of lawmakers who have settled on sexual harassment claims?
I do. I really do. I think they should.
Jeffrey Toobin, I'm sure you've allowed all of this to wash over you. What's your takeaway?
And let me just say that in agreement, I mean, the idea that Congress is spending taxpayer money to settle sexual harassment cases and we don't know who the harassers are is shocking and appalling. And every day that goes by, whether it was $15 million or $17 million, it is unbelievable that we don't know who we as taxpayers are subsidizing as sexual harassers. Now, as for the president's statement that women are very special, well, I guess it's hard to disagree that women are very special, but I guess the only special ones are the ones who accuse Democrats, because he doesn't believe the ones who accuse him, and he doesn't believe the ones who accuse Roy Moore. So, you can take that for what it's worth. But he's certainly right about the payments in Congress.
And Ron Brownstein, we just heard from one member of Congress, Mike Quigley, a few moments ago, who said that the system for reporting these allegations up on Capitol Hill is designed to protect the lawmakers. I mean, that is pretty stunning.
No, That was a very strong statement, and one that kind of hints at the momentum that is gathering behind reconsidering this process in all aspects of American life, all different kinds of industries. Can I turn back to Alabama for 1 second? Because I think there is a battle and war issue here. I mean, it is understandable in some sense that the White House is reluctant to lose another seat, any seat in the Senate, when they are dealing with such a narrow majority. And if they can't finish the tax bill by December 12th, that could have a significant implication. But even if you win that battle, there could be a much larger cost in the broader political war here, because what you've seen already is, in particular, college-educated white women are very cool toward this president, very dubious of him on many fronts. And in Virginia, we saw that translate into a big movement toward the Democratic candidate. Ralph Northam won 58% of college-educated white women. And what I think the president has done is he's made it, as Rebecca said, more difficult for Republicans to disassociate from Roy Moore. I mean, they were talking about expelling him if he wins. It's going to be a lot harder to do that after today. And I think the risk is that they tar the party in a way that, in particular, with these upscale white women, could produce really big numbers in 2018 that reverberate far beyond Alabama in the battle for control of the Senate and the House.
Well, Ron, one thing that the president did say in those comments, he described some of the women in Alabama as Trump women, Trump voters.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're going to right now. A lot of women voters stayed with Donald Trump, even after the Access Hollywood thing played out during the last month of the election. Is it possible that the president is thinking, you know what, and maybe there's some overconfidence here, that he thinks that those women will stay with him and stay with Roy Moore in the end?
Well, there's a real sharp class divide, right? I mean, Donald Trump, I would argue the biggest single reason he's president is because he won over 60% of white women without a college degree, particularly in the Midwestern states that tipped the election, even as the college white women moved away from him. And what we saw in Virginia was a very stark divergence. As I said, Ralph Northam won almost 60% of the college-educated white women, and the blue-collar white women, even though their approval of Trump had declined, 2/3 of them stuck with Ed Gillespie. So Democrats have not shown the ability to kind of peel those voters away, even though they have expressed more skepticism about Trump in office than they did on the campaign trail, probably largely around the efforts to repeal the health care bill. So I don't know if that is the risk. I think the risk is more concentrated with those professional women who are responding, I think, very viscerally to these allegations. We see them really driving the allegations in most of the cases that have emerged so far. And they are also a constituency that, as I said, have shown they are willing to take out their dislike of Trump on other Republicans, and that should make a lot of Republicans nervous, particularly those in those big suburban white-collar seats in the House.
And Rebecca Berg, would we be in this place right now, would the president be in this place right now, if he had a couple of wins on the scoreboard, if he had some legislative victories that he could look back on throughout the year? It sounds as though he is so desperate for a legislative win on tax reform that he's taking this position on Roy Moore. If he had a whole slew of wins throughout the course of this first year in office, from Obamacare to whatever else, immigration and the travel ban and so on, that perhaps it wouldn't feel like everything is riding on this tax reform bill, and losing a seat would be so costly for him.
There certainly is some urgency to this for the president, and not only reflecting on what has already happened or not happened, might be the more correct phrase here, for the president in his first year in office, but he also has to think about the next 3 years in office. And we all know that 2018 is going to be a difficult year for Republicans across the board. The Senate map is a little bit better, but they're likely to struggle on the House side. So he's thinking, you know, how can I shore up my majority now to prepare for what is to come? If he's going to get anything done in his final 2 years of his first term, if Republicans lose the House, the Senate is his only firewall, the only Republican-controlled chamber potentially. So this is a longer-term play for him as well. It's important to remember, though, that he is also politically vulnerable from some of these recent races we've seen in Virginia, the Alabama primary on the Republican side. Donald Trump has gone out there and tried to insert himself in these races, energize Republican voters, energize specifically Trump voters, and he has failed in those races.
It hasn't worked out lately. That's right. Okay, stand by. We've got more to talk about coming up after the break. We'll get into this issue and some others, and one that Jeffrey Toobin had talked about yesterday, the AT&T Time Warner deal. The president weighed in on that. We'll have more on that in just a few moments. Multiple breaking stories, including President Trump speaking out against, or now in favor, I should say, of Senate candidate Roy Moore, repeatedly telling reporters Moore totally denies these accusations made by multiple women. Also breaking word, House Ethics Committee will investigate sexual harassment allegations against Democratic Congressman John Conyers. And we are back with our political specialist, David Swerdlick. How serious is this matter facing John Conyers? In our last, or I should say earlier this hour, Mike Quigley, a congressman from Illinois, Democrat, basically said if he were John Conyers, he would step aside.
Right. He said if the BuzzFeed reporting is true, that Conyers should step aside. And I think you will have more Democrats saying that precisely because, one, we're in this climate where Congress realizes it's under scrutiny. Two, people in Congressman Conyers' own party feel like they have to step up. And three, there's this total lack of transparency in the way these particular allegations were handled. Handled by this closed office on the Hill. Apparently, according to BuzzFeed, that a settlement was reached using funds out of Congressman Conyers' own or House budget rather than some separate funds. That is sort of the antithesis, I think, of what people expect from their members of Congress. And that was reflected in what Congressman Quigley said to you.
And Jeffrey
can I just raise another point about John Conyers? He's 88 years old, and anybody who has spent 5 minutes in Congress watching him in action knows he's out of it. He is too old to be in Congress. He is not up to the job. And, you know, he is a walking advertisement for term limits. I know that the Supreme Court has said they are unconstitutional, but it is absolutely outrageous that that man in that condition is getting a salary from the taxpayers to do this job. I mean, he is just not capable of being.
Well, he was elected, but Jeffrey,
right.
but people of that age in life can serve effectively in Congress. I think maybe in the case of John Conyers, it's not so effectively, and it seems that these accusations are so serious that he had to use some of his own funds to settle a case that was brought to the attention of congressional investigators. So it seems.
And remember we talk about, he has to settle the case. It's not him settling the case. It's the taxpayer settling that case. And we can talk about which account it comes from, but it's our tax dollars that are going to, because these men are abusing their positions, and the idea that there is no system for reporting to us, the taxpayers, how this money is spent is just outrageous.
And Mike Quigley also made the point that the system that exists up on Capitol Hill for reporting these abuses is just so out of whack, so out of line with what goes on in private business around the country. Ron Brownstein, I want to ask you about this Quinnipiac poll. Help us crunch some numbers here. This is pretty extraordinary. A new Quinnipiac poll asked whether people would still vote for a candidate accused of sexual harassment by multiple women. 81% of Democrats say they would definitely not vote for a candidate accused of sexual harassment, but only 41% of Republicans. What does that tell you? Is there a Trump factor there, I guess?
Yeah, I think this is a temporary moment in terms of that contrast here, because I think many Republicans would view this as a referendum as a coded way of asking whether they would vote for Donald Trump. But I think the Alabama race will be an important measure of just how far our politics has gone toward becoming a purely tribal or parliamentary style of election in which the character and the qualities of the individual doesn't matter that much. I mean, that is the argument that Kellyanne Conway and the president, in effect, is making. We need a vote. We need a vote for Supreme Court justices. We need a vote for taxes. It doesn't really matter who that vote is. We just need a vote from Alabama. And I think that, with the specificity and the credibility of the widespread allegations, not only from the women themselves, but also ancillary witnesses like former police officials in Gadsden against Roy Moore, I think this will be a powerful test of how many voters, in this case Republican voters in Alabama, are willing to vote for someone whom they have these doubts about simply because they want his vote on the agenda. It is a moment, I've often said in modern American congressional elections, the color on the front of the jersey matters more than the name on the back of the jersey. And in this election, I think we'll see just how far that imbalance has tilted.
And Rebecca Berg, let me ask you, what does it say that Charlie Rose can just be gone? Network television, he loses his job, and yet the voters can't fire a member of Congress for this sort of thing. We have to wait for the results of an ethics committee investigation, which could drag on for who knows how long. it doesn't seem like there's a fair system in place for dealing with this sort of thing up on Capitol Hill.
Right. Well, it's a different case with Roy Moore than it is with someone like Conyers, because in the case of Roy Moore, voters have all of the information. It is out there for them to make their decision. For Conyers, who knows if he would have had a competitive primary in elections past, which he really hasn't for as long as he's been in Congress, if that information about his sexual misconduct or alleged sexual misconduct had been available to voters. And so for American politics, that's just how it works. Voters are the company board, the CEO. They are the ones who make the ultimate decision, and they have their priorities. It might be tax reform, it might be healthcare, it might be the character of the person they're voting for. The difference in these cases, do they have the information they need to make the decision? Do they have the information to consider the person's full character?
If you don't,
Jim, you want to talk about who's fired? How about Billy Bush? Billy Bush got fired for listening to Donald Trump talk, and Donald Trump got elected president of the United States.
Very different standards, absolutely. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Ron, we'll get you on this next time. We got to get going, but thank you so much. We appreciate it. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you. Just ahead, a protest by State Department employees who say Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is violating U.S. law on child soldiers.
This is CNN Breaking News.
AT&T Chairman and CEO Randall Stephenson, joined by the General Counsel for AT&T, as well as another attorney working on the case on behalf of AT&T and Time Warner, Daniel Petrocelli, holding a news conference there talking about the Department of Justice's decision to try to block this merger. Brian Stelter, let me bring you in. Pretty interesting comment from Randall Stephenson. He said, let me address the elephant in the room, whether CNN is at issue here. And he said, frankly, I don't know. That's a pretty stunning statement.
It is, and he's acknowledging what has been whispered about, what has been rumored for many months. Just to take our viewers kind of behind the scenes here a little bit. As Jeffrey Toobin said, we're talking about our own network here at CNN, the channel you're watching at home right now. But what's interesting about this, given President Trump's animosity towards CNN, is that there have been concern, there have been speculation that maybe somehow the government would try to force a spin-off of CNN, basically say to AT&T, you've got to sell CNN to get this deal through. There was concern that the government would try to force a change in leadership here at CNN. None of that based in evidence that was actually written down anywhere on paper, no smoking gun emails or anything, but definitely a lot of concern. And now we hear AT&T CEO Randall Stephenson for the first time acknowledging that concern and saying he doesn't know if that is the case or not, that he doesn't know if political pressure has been applied, and that that's really why the government's going to court today to block the AT&T Time Warner deal. To be clear, Jim, the DOJ denies that. Officials held a background briefing about an hour ago where they made clear they resent the suggestion that political pressure has been applied. But that is going to be a key part of this legal fight. If this does end up before a judge in the coming months, AT&T is going to seek evidence, going to seek emails from the government trying to see if there was any improper influence or interference. We're definitely in uncharted territory when it comes to these media mega deals. Viewers might remember the Comcast-NBC deal about 7 years ago. It was the last kind of media deal on this scale in the United States. And the Obama administration went ahead and approved it with some conditions, meaning the typical kind of things you attach to a deal of that scope. But in this case, that didn't happen. The Trump administration is going a different direction, not just attaching conditions to a deal saying you got to make sure you play fair in the marketplace. Instead, the government actually going to court today, something that would have been unbelievable a year ago, but now is inevitable. And this is something that's going to play out at least for several months, Jim. Could take even longer than that.
And Jeffrey Toobin, Randall Stephenson talked about the elephant in the room. How much will President Trump be the elephant in the courtroom, do you think, in this case?
I don't think it's out of the question that the President of the United States may be deposed in this lawsuit. I mean, his role in this is obviously critical. I mean, let's be blunt here. The President of the United States hates CNN. He's been tweeting, about trains hitting people wearing CNN signs. I mean, actual violence against CNN. So, I mean, this is not some like speculation on my part. The president has said it over and over again that he despises the place where we work. So that's relevant. The other thing is, during the campaign, as you just played the video, he said he was going to stop the deal. I mean, that's not speculation. That's not innuendo. That's just quoting what candidate Trump said. Now, what's important here is that it is not legal for the Justice Department to stop a merger because the president or any member of the executive branch doesn't like the companies involved. There are laws about antitrust. They can only be stopped if they are anti-competitive. There are rules that apply that have nothing to do with the personal animosity of the president or anyone else. And the challenge here for the court is going to be to determine whether these laws prevent the merger or this whole thing was just cooked up because the President of the United States and the people around him can't stand the company that we work for.
And David Axelrod, doesn't it bother you, all these media companies joining forces and conglomerating and becoming bigger and larger companies? Isn't that been a complaint of the Democratic Party for years now, that the more you see these companies coming together, the fewer voices you see out on the airwaves and so on?
Not just the Democratic Party. I think that there's been real concern about consolidation, not just in the media, but in many realms. It'll be interesting to see if this new spirit of populism and anti-merger philosophy infuses all the decisions that the Justice Department is going to make coming down the line. For example, Sinclair Media is trying to buy Tribune Broadcasting. That deal's been announced. That's under review. The FCC just loosened up its own rules to enable that. Sinclair happens to be a media outlet that's very sympathetic to the president. It'll be interesting to see. The Justice Department is supposed to be reviewing that deal, how they handle that. I will say this, though. Jeffrey Toobin's characterization of the president's feelings about CNN is probably one assertion on CNN that the president won't dispute. I think that I think he will well acknowledge his feelings about CNN. Yeah. And as I said earlier, the real question that we face today about all our institutions, all of these administrative and legal proceedings is, are they on the up and up, or are they being tainted by political interference? That is the situation that we've been delivered to by the president's loose talk, his use of Twitter, his statements at campaign rallies, and even as president, and it's bad for the country.
And Brian Stelter, David Axelrod brings up a good point, and just to tie this up with a bow, I mean, Sinclair Broadcasting has been expanding its reach across the country, and they make no mistake, they make no bones about it. In many ways, that outfit is there to support President Trump. I mean, it is in their content.
Yeah, there's a lot of objective news reporters at local stations owned by Sinclair, but the company's owner has injected conservative politics into some of those newscasts, into the programming. So Sinclair is trying to get bigger by buying lots of other local stations, and David's right, that the government's made it easier to do that. The Trump administration's made it easier to do that. At the same time, another part of the Trump administration, the DOJ, is suing to block AT&T and Time Warner. Could be completely unrelated, but it looks odd to a lot of people. Look, we're going to see this litigated in the months to come. The government has a case they've laid out in their lawsuit this evening. It says this deal would harm consumers by raising prices across the board because AT&T would use content to make it more expensive for AT&T's rivals like Verizon. But you can hear from the AT&T CEO, he seems to think there could be something fishy going on here, something political. So now the battle lines are drawn, Jim.
Battle lines are drawn, and we'll find out what is fishy when this goes to court, if it goes to court. Brian Stelter, everybody, thank you very much for your comments on this. We'll have more on this in just a little while. Also today, President Trump announced he is designating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism. The move puts Kim Jong-un's regime in line for what President Trump calls the highest level of U.S. sanctions. This comes just as we're getting unexpected proof of how difficult life is in North Korea, even for its elites. Let's bring in CNN's Brian Todd. Brian, what are you learning?
Jim, we have new information tonight on the condition of a North Korean soldier who defected in recent days. He was severely wounded when his own comrades opened fire on him as he scrambled across the DMZ. South Korea's semi-official news agency Yonhap is reporting that the soldier still has not regained consciousness. But it's what was discovered inside this soldier's body that is revealing new information to intelligence agencies tonight about North Korea's army. Now, we have to warn viewers, some may find images in this story disturbing. A young North Korean staff sergeant fighting for his life tonight after making a desperate scramble across the DMZ to South Korea. He was shot several times by his own comrades as he made his dash, hit in the shoulder, arms, knees, and abdomen. Tonight, disturbing new information. South Korean doctors say as they worked furiously to repair his almost fatal bullet wounds, they made a grotesque discovery in his intestines. Several large parasitic worms, one nearly a foot long.
In my over 20-year-long career as a surgeon, I have only seen something like this in a textbook.
Surgeons removed the worms and are treating the soldier for infections along with everything else. How could a young conscript, believed to be in his mid-20s, have been ravaged by full-grown parasites?
North Korea doesn't use chemical fertilizer anymore because it can't. It's too expensive. The North Korean regime has been using animal and human manure as fertilizer. If you don't sanitize this first, bad things happen to your population.
Reuters reports that North Korea's merciless young dictator Kim Jong-un in recent years personally ordered farmers to use human and animal feces to fertilize their crops. Former U.S. commanders in the region tell CNN tonight this soldier's case is revealing new intelligence on the rest of North Korea's million-man army. The defector had been stationed on North Korea's side of the so-called Joint Security Area, a heavily guarded portion of the DMZ where North and South Korean soldiers stare each other down just yards apart.
He's the very top. Anybody who's assigned to the Joint Security Area is considered elite. Now, think about this. If this guy had all these problems, all these parasites, just think about what the normal conscript has regarding his health.
Experts say Kim Jong-un and his top echelon military officers are fed well. But even soldiers in North Korea's elite military units have to do things that other nations' troops can't imagine.
If you're a conscript and you're not an officer, you have to go out and forage and hunt and gather. And part of the foraging and the hunting and gathering may be growing your own food in patches near where you're stationed. Part of it may be pilfering from the local farmers and villagers. And part of it is going to be cadging from your family.
Now, military analysts say U.S. and South Korean forces are going to use this soldier's condition to their advantage. They'll figure out ways to cut food and supply lines in the event of combat operations. And they may even use this case for so-called psyops, sending messages to the North Korean commanders and their conscripts that they know just how bad their conditions are.
More disturbing information coming out of North Korea. Brian Todd, thank you very much. Coming up, President Trump puts North Korea back on the list of nations that sponsor terrorism. The move comes with additional sanctions, but are they mostly symbolic?
Everywhere we went.